And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Anti-war protests have already begun in Chicago ahead of this weekend's NATO summit. The two-day meeting is NATO's largest in its 60-year history. The gathering will draw representatives from some 50 countries, including leaders of the 28 members of the military alliance. On Tuesday, NATO invited Pakistan to attend after the country proposed reopening its Afghan border to NATO supplies. The summit comes at a time when public scrutiny of NATO is on the rise because of the 11-year war in Afghanistan and NATO's bombing of Libya last year. The NATO summit is also expected to attract thousands of protesters from a diverse coalition of organizations, including unions, anti-war groups, immigrant rights organizations, and Occupy groups. This is Zoe Sigmund of Occupy Chicago.
Mayor 1% Emanuel has issued an invitation to NATO's warmongers to invade Chicago, bringing the military arm of the 1% right here to our city. For some Chicagoans, the presence of military policing will be a taste of the daily reality of communities in Afghanistan and Libya. For other Chicagoans, the warnings of violence downtown echo the reality of police repression they face in their everyday life. NATO is a symptom of the global system of violence and oppression at the hands of the 1%.
The week of protests began on Monday when dozens of peace activists picketed at President Obama's campaign headquarters. 8 protesters from the Catholic Workers Group were arrested for refusing to leave the lobby. On Tuesday, 4 immigrants' rights activists were arrested after refusing to leave a federal courthouse that hears immigration cases. Chicago was originally scheduled to host both the G8 and NATO conferences this week, but the White House moved the G8 summit to Camp David, the heavily guarded presidential country retreat in Maryland. Some activists plan to protest outside Camp David before making the 11-hour journey to the NATO protests in Chicago.
Chicago is preparing a massive security operation to keep the protesters away from the NATO summit. The Department of Homeland Security has declared the summit to be a national special security event, a designation normally reserved for the Olympics, the Super Bowl, and the Democratic and Republican national conventions. The American Civil Liberties Union says the NATO summit could be the first public test of H.R. 347, a new law that expands the ability of the Secret Service to suppress protests in or around certain restricted zones. To talk more about the NATO summit and the protests, we go now to Chicago, where we're joined by 2 veteran Chicago activists, Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dohrn. In the 60s, both were involved in SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, later the Weather Underground. Bill Ayers is a retired education professor and author of many books, including Teaching Toward Freedom, Moral Commitment and Ethical Action in the Classroom, and also Fugitive Days, a memoir. Bernardine Dohrn is a clinical professor at Northwestern Law School. She founded Northwestern's Children and Family Justice Center. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Can you talk about what the plans are for this weekend and why you're so deeply involved with the protests against the NATO summit? Let's begin with Bernardine Dohrn.
Good morning, Amy. We're deeply involved because NATO is a global secret cabal. It is the military arm of the global 1%. And really, I think NATO has become background to how we hear the news. NATO forces, NATO bombings, and when you try to find out what NATO is, you realize that it is the largest global military alliance in human history, and that its key elements are that it is about permanent war, it is about dirty war, it is about nuclear war, and it is about hot wars, really 4 of them right now. So we don't really know what it is. They are secretive, and when I first went to look at a NATO website to see what it was, a dove floats across the screen on the first page of the official NATO website. By the end of the NATO website, it's helicopters, fighter planes, and drones. So we, I think, are not made safer by NATO. It is secretive, and it is opposed to peace and to our future. So a wide array of Chicagoans have come together in coalition meeting really for 9 months, to stand up and ask for peace, to really say we don't need NATO. We need an end to the war in Afghanistan. We need a complete end to the war in Iraq. We need to rethink what just happened in Libya and what's going on every day in Pakistan. So there's an array of events happening, beginning with the National Nurses Association rally, a permitted rally on Friday. I think the support of unions and workers, the support of African-American activists in the city and Latino and immigrant groups, a wide array of women's and activist groups and Occupy and students, and in a way, most importantly, the Iraqi and Afghan vets against the war, who will be leading the big demonstration on Sunday when NATO opens its meeting here.
So, Bernardine, Dorhn, what are the activists who are gathering in Chicago? What are they calling for NATO to do? How do they want the organization to become more accountable?
Well, we think that NATO should be meeting in an underground bunker or on a remote island. The idea that NATO's been invited to Chicago to have the kind of war games that have been going on here for the last 6 months and now accelerated this week, so that we have restricted zones and we have the shutdown of universities and colleges, the shutdown of businesses, the closings of the major museums here. It is being treated as really a practice military zone. And we actually feel very strongly, I think the way Americans feel, that we want an end to these wars. These wars are hated by the American people. They don't make us safer in any way. In fact, they jeopardize our safety. Bombing foreign countries, occupying other countries in the world does not make us safer. Killing civilians without any accountability makes people angry. And so our resources, this enormous amount of money and resources, and suddenly we don't have money here for community mental health clinics. We don't have money for public libraries or for schools. We don't have money for public transportation. But somehow we have the millions of dollars necessary, or the mayor accessed the money to hold this event right here in the city of Chicago. So we want peace and not this permanent wars abroad and military war games and national security state at home.
Yeah, we would like to see an end to NATO, and we would like to see in every country, every member country of NATO, there's a popular movement to ask its government to leave NATO. We want NATO disbanded. NATO is an instrument of war, and after 9/11, it transformed itself. I mean, its name is a historical, anomaly, but it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But after 9/11, the Bush administration invoked Article 5, and it became the instrument of permanent war, preemptive war, and it really has no place in a free and peaceful and democratic world.
Well, then, Bill Ayers, let me get your comment on Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the Secretary General of NATO, on why NATO continued to exist after the end of the Cold War. He recently wrote, quote, "NATO needed no external reasons to exist, yet history would provide them soon enough. In Bosnia and Kosovo, NATO intervened to stop massive human rights violations. In Libya, we enforced a UN Security Council resolution to protect civilians. And in Afghanistan, we're denying a safe haven to extremists." Again, those are the comments of the head of NATO. Those are the comments of Secretary General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Bill Ayers, your response.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with all of those is that they're rationales and they're self-affirming. They don't have any transparency in the sense that people or governments can intervene and say, no, this is wrong. We don't want to be a part of that. In fact, I mean, Bernardine began by talking about these kind of 4 aspects: permanent war, dirty war, nuclear war, nuclear preparation, and then hot wars. What NATO does is it allows every government deniability. So the United States and every other country in NATO violates the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But they do it by saying it's not us who are violating it, it's NATO is doing it. It's not U.S. nuclear bombs in Europe, it's NATO bombs in Europe. Well, that's just completely false. Afghanistan is a case in point. 90,000 American troops. The next largest force is Great Britain, 9,000. And that coalition is unraveling. The headlines in all the local papers are about the attempt of NATO to hold together through this summit. The election in France of the Socialist Party gives new urgency to the fact that NATO is unraveling at the top. People are not in favor of these wars anywhere in the world. And in the United States, there's only something like 27% of Americans support these wars. And yet, the wars go on. A real crisis for democracy, a crisis for the peace movement.
We're going to break and then come back. Bernardine, we're going to break and then come back to this discussion. We're joined by Bill Ayers, retired education professor at University of Illinois at Chicago, and Bernardine Dohrn, clinical professor at Northwestern Law School. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with them in a moment, and we'll also be speaking with a soldier who served in Iraq and Kuwait in 2003, who will be returning his medals at the NATO protests this weekend. Stay with us.